Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in and joining us tonight. My name is Steve Jamroz. I'm the Director of Marketing here at DAN. And tonight, I'm here with my colleague, Greg Moore, and we welcome you to the August edition of our 2021 webinar series, where we've been coming together each month to discuss a new topic on dive safety to keep you better prepared for that next dive. If you're watching tonight for the first time, tonight's presentation will last approximately 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll follow it up with a question and answer session at the end. If you're viewing this presentation on the event page over at dan.org, keep in mind you won't be able to ask questions there. You'll need to hop on over to the Dan YouTube page where you can put your questions into the box, and we'll get those at the end. Also, this webinar will be recorded tonight, so if you either come in late or need to leave early, you'll be able to watch the webinar in its entirety over on the dan.org dan.org YouTube channel tomorrow. Tonight's presentation is 13 ways divers run out of air and how not to. Our presenter this evening is Greg Moore. Greg is our program manager here at DAN, and he's been instructing divers for over 30 years, a lot of experience. Greg's a DAN instructor, he's a PADI IDCI staff instructor, a PADI Master Scuba instructor, and he also teaches the scuba program over at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so he's got lots of experience in the water. But before we begin tonight, I'd just like to thank everyone who's tuned in on behalf of the entire DAN team. It's through your membership and support of our dive accident insurance programs, travel insurance, professional programs that we're able to continue producing educational content like this. So thank you very much for your support and for tuning in. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Greg, and we'll begin tonight's presentation.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. I, too, would like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about 13 ways to run out of air and how not to. So after 40 years of Dan telling you how not to run out of air and how not to make mistakes, we're actually going to talk about the mistakes, and the hope being that will prevent you from making that mistake in the future. So let's go ahead and get started. So tonight we'll cover the most common ways to run out of air, how much air do you really need on a dive, and give a few safety tips to prevent emergencies. Of course, the basic premise of diving is our self-contained underwater breathing apparatuses are only useful as long as the tank contains sufficient breathing gas. Scuba equipment allows us to breathe underwater, extending our ability to explore. Without breathing gas, our time is limited by the dangers of asphyxia and drowning. During your dive training, whether it's recent, in the present, or in the past, we learned that we understood the breathing gas needs, how to calculate the limits of available gas, how to monitor the remaining gas pressure, and that we must return to the surface in a timely manner with enough gas to inflate our BCDs. The most common incident, unfortunately, even with class training, is running out of breathing gas, and the dive incident is the #1 fatality or cause of fatalities in diving accidents. Even the most skilled divers can make mistakes and run out of gas. In this presentation, we'll cover the 13 most common errors that lead to out-of-air emergencies and how to avoid these situations. First, make sure that we understand our breathing gas needs. Your breathing rate depends on your level of exercise and depth. The higher your level of exercise, the more oxygen you need, and the more CO2 you will produce. In order to flush that CO2 from your lungs while diving, you must inhale breathing gas. The following chart shows the relationship between depth, pressure, exercise, and breathing gas requirements. The deeper the depth and the higher the level of exercise, the greater the demand for breathing gas. Our self-contained underwater breathing apparatuses are only useful as long as the tank contains sufficient breathing gas. Scuba equipment allows us to breathe underwater, extending our ability to explore. Without breathing gas, our time is limited by the dangers of asphyxia and drowning. So let's take a look at this chart. First of all, we want to take into account how much air it actually takes to ventilate our lungs. If we look here at rest, that would be at absolute at rest. At the surface, we need 8 liters per minute. Light to moderate activity, which I would consider a normal scuba dive, would be about 20 liters per minute. And then notice vigorous exercise ratchets that up to 70 liters per minute. And once again, that's at the surface. At a mere 33 feet, we jump up to 16 liters per minute at rest, and jumping over to vigorous exercise, 140 liters per minute. And finally, at 100 feet at rest, 32 liters per minute, vigorous exercise, 280 liters per minute. So let's look at the impact that really has. So with light to moderate activity at the surface versus resting, we have 3 times the requirements in liters per minute, and with vigorous exercise, 9 times the requirements liters per minute. And if we jump down to 100 feet versus 32 liters per minute at rest, we jump up to 80 liters per minute at 100 feet on a normal scuba dive. And if you find yourself in a vigorous exercise situation, it would be 9 times.
Hey, Greg, that's a really interesting slide, and to just like to jump in here for maybe the folks who are watching tonight who are not familiar with our Return to Diving program, Return to Diving Safely program that we launched this spring. You know, one of the things that will affect that chart in the vigorous exercise is, you know, the diver's level of fitness. Are they in shape? Has there been a long period of inactivity? So there's a wealth of information there on dan.org as far as how to evaluate your health status, talk to your doctor, because if you're out of shape, those numbers can be even higher than 9 times.
Absolutely. If you're out of shape, you're going to be working harder. You'll fall more quickly into the vigorous exercise category, and your gas demands will increase.
Will be
also
higher, sure. So
sure.
Be careful with that.
So let's understand our breathing needs based on these aluminum 80s, pretty much the standard of the dive community. The aluminum 80, as I mentioned, is the most commonly used tank. As far as specifications, the internal volume of the aluminum 80 is only 0.39 cubic feet. That's always a startlingly small number to me. The maximum pressure allowed in an 80 is 3,000 pounds of pressure, and an 80 cubic foot cylinder will hold 2,265 liters of gas. So where does that leave us? Well, now we want to know how long our breathing gas will last in an aluminum 80. So once again, let's jump back over here at the surface at rest. So let's go over here and see at the surface at rest, we're at 215 minutes. With light to moderate activity, 70 minutes. Now, I like to tell my students that if they go out, newly certified, buy new gear, come home, maybe they don't have a dive plan, they sit down on their couch, get out their Xbox, and start playing. Sitting on their couch with light to moderate activity, maybe they head to the refrigerator in the middle, they'd burn about 70 minutes with that cylinder. But if they jump down to a mere 30 feet on their first dive, that same level of activity would be a mere 35 minutes. And that's when I usually get the attention of students. Someone will stop and say, wait, what? They're startled that your air consumption can increase that much jumping down only 30 feet. And those of you who remember your open water training, remember that that's essentially going from 1 atmosphere there at the surface down to 2 atmospheres at 33 feet. And if we drop down to 100 feet, we're down to a mere 17 minutes. And you can see over here on the right how vigorous exercise drastically impacts that. Down at 100 feet with vigorous exercise, we only have about 5 minutes of bottom time.
So it sounds like there's a number of factors in not only the depth but the activity that influence your air consumption. But what about even something like currents? I mean, is that going to have an impact on the rate that somebody breathes gas?
Absolutely. Currents have a dramatic impact. You always want to factor in currents as much as possible when you plan your dive. For example, in Cozumel, all dives are planned down current. I think you'd have a very difficult time coming back up current in Cozumel. You and I have both had the opportunity to dive the Duane in Key Largo. I was with a group one time and we dropped down on the deck about 100 feet, began our dive on the starboard side, which was the side away from the current. We didn't think there was much current. We had a wonderful time touring down the wreck, and as we turned across the stern, planning to come back up the port side, we suddenly realized we weren't going anywhere because there was much more of a current than we had anticipated. So we dropped back over on the starboard side, hugged in close to the wreck, made it back to our planned descent line. But you really have to be careful not fighting against the current, because everything in both these charts comes into play, and you can find yourself in trouble with one of these 13 reasons to run out of air.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really great advice. And I think just to summarize what Greg was saying, I think it's the depth, it's the level of activity. It could be your fitness level that impacts it. It could be current. So there's a whole number of things going on. So you really can't base it on your dive buddies' air consumption, thinking if they're good to go, that you're good to go. You really need to watch what you're doing.
No, absolutely. You are responsible for yourself first, but of course you're equally responsible for monitoring your buddy's situation also. You should have great communication there. Let's move on to the next slide. We're now at the lead-in to our 13 most common causes of out-of-air emergencies. So we have these mooring lines holding the ship in place, and if you adhere to these 13 reasons not to run out of air, you'll find yourself a safe diver, just like the ship is safely moored to the dock. So first of all, in the category of lack of awareness, we have diving too deep. Gas consumption increases dramatically with depth. We just talked about that, and your decompression obligation builds quickly, and you may need more gas for decompression stops. Remember, an aluminum 80 is not meant for a decompression dive. It just doesn't have the capacity to allow you to make that decompression stop obligation you incur on a deco dive. And finally, running out of gas at depth puts you at risk of a long, hazardous emergency ascent. And you can maximize your time at shallower depths and easily reach the surface in the event of emergency. Our next lack of awareness situation is just plain staying too long. Sooner or later, you'll consume your gas reserves and determine in advance the tank pressure at which you need to turn back and start your ascent. So you need to pay attention during your dive and be prepared to begin your ascent when the right time comes. Invariably, just at that point, you'll see some wonderful new object on a dive, a lobster crawling out, a turtle swimming by. So you have to maintain focus and stay with your dive plan.
Greg, before you go on here, are there, the scuba technology and equipment nowadays has gotten very advanced. So we have advanced computers and all kinds of tools to help us monitor our air. But what are your thoughts on other tools? Simple tools like dive slates, like, writing the time you're supposed to be back on the boat, your turn pressure down when you might be photographing it, get distracted. I mean, sure. What are your thoughts on those type of tools?
Absolutely. That all goes into your dive plan. And if you can anticipate your turn time, things like that, write those down. Also, make sure you and your buddy are on the same page. You're setting the stage for a far safer dive. You don't want to be winging it during the dive. In fighting a strong current, hunting and lacking buoyancy control can affect your air consumption. Exertion depth may speed up your depletion of your tank up to 20 times, an amazing difference. If you're not accustomed to diving in strong currents or surf, seek training prior to diving in these environments. Anytime, in fact, that you go to a new dive site that you're not comfortable with, it's a good idea to hook up with the local instructor or dive master and get accustomed to those characteristics. And usually those people are familiar with the locale, and you'll find yourself having a much more exciting dive working with them than if you just headed out on your own, hoping for the best. The next example of lack of awareness is not monitoring your pressure gauge. You need to be air aware. Monitor your air supply. Check your pressure gauge regularly and communicate your supply with your buddy.
Hey, I've got another question for you on this one, and you've got an old school analog gauge up there. What's the philosophy nowadays? You know, the technology is advanced to digital and the computers. Is it good to have a couple digital gauges, a digital and an analog? Is one safer or better than another, or what are your thoughts?
I wouldn't say one is better or safer than the other. I think a integrated air dive computer is a wonderful tool. It always knows exactly where you are and, more importantly, perhaps where you need to be. But they're not infallible. So it is indeed a good idea to have an analog gauge attached to your first stage also. They're just about bulletproof, and you can monitor your air supply that way. And there again, that makes you far less likely to have an out-of-air situation. We're moving now over to lack of awareness. Ignoring anxiety as a factor is a serious problem in scuba diving. We're all enthusiastic about diving, or we wouldn't be diving. And sometimes we can unknowingly influence other divers and make them anxious with our enthusiasm, encouraging them to go diving. So please be careful about peer pressure in diving. If someone is not particularly ready to go on a dive, don't encourage them. It may have nothing to do with their mental approach to that dive, but just in case, you should be aware of that. As far as you personally, if you're anxious about a dive, you certainly should not do that dive. It's a good idea to be comfortable with any dive before you do it, and on any given day, you may feel like it's a bad idea not to participate in a dive, and you should act accordingly. Procedural problems are very evident, but still crop up with scuba diving. Believe it or not, starting with a less than full tank is a problem with diving. Regardless of how short an immersion you're planning, do not start your dive with less than a full tank. Never descend to retrieve a lost piece of equipment or an anchor if the tank is nearly empty. And by the way, just because you leave the dock with the tank that's gauged full, particularly after a boat ride, don't assume it's still full and gear up and drop in the water with it. Things can change during a 2 or 3 hour boat ride, or a delay between checking your gear on the dock and entering the water. Not opening the tank valve is also an issue. When I started diving, in fact, somewhat until recently, we were taught to open our tank all the way and then close it a quarter turn. But now the standard of the community is to open your tank all the way. And then, of course, just like we always did, take a breath or two out of your regulator and make sure it's breathing properly. And also monitor particularly your analog pressure gauge and make sure the needle is not dropping at all as you take that breath, which would be a good indication that your valve was not open properly or your first stage was not functioning properly.
Yeah, another thing, and we work with a lot of dive operators for risk mitigation programs. Always, use standard safety protocols of diving with the buddy, and make sure that operator they're checking the divers, making sure that the valve is open before the giant stride off the boat. So there's lots of different things they can do, and even before you leave on a trip, is do a little investigation. If you're diving with an operator maybe you're not familiar with or you haven't been, I'm going to ask some questions and see what type of reputation that operation has to make sure they're adhering to the latest safety standards.
Absolutely. There's no excuse for a diver going off a boat with a fully open tank on their back in this day and time. Our next procedural problem is omitting a pre-dive buddy check, and not just a pre-dive buddy check. We feel pretty strongly you should have a printed pre-dive checklist to prevent mental lapses. In fact, a mental checklist is somewhat of an oxymoron. You actually need a printed list to make sure you touch on all aspects. Shabar Ranapurwala was a fellow here at Dan while he was completing his PhD work, and he's actually now a PhD at the University of North Carolina in the School of Public Health. Interesting, unlike most of the academics who find their way through Dan, Shabar was not a diver. He was just interested in the statistics and the background in diving accidents. So Shabar delved very deeply into our dive accident information and found an amazing correlation between lack of checklist use and dive accidents after that. I spoke with Shabar this week, and he provided me this quote kind of summarizing the situation and how much a written checklist can impact a dive. Shabar said that people who do not have a checklist or who memorize a checklist have twice as many major mishaps as people who use a written checklist. The major mishaps include rapid ascent, entanglement, entrapment, low or out of air scenarios, and other equipment malfunctions, all of which can lead to serious injuries. And I think all of those things on that list are something we all agree we should easily avoid by using a written checklist. Another procedural problem is frequent depth changes in BCD adjustments, often referred to as yo-yo diving. Yo-yo diving, or using your BCD frequently to move up and down in the water column, can quickly deplete your gas supply. Remember, at depth, you have to use more gas to adjust your buoyancy. So that has a dramatic impact on your gas supply. And yo-yo diving also increases the risk of pulmonary barotrauma and decompression sickness beyond the scope of this talk tonight, but a major concern always at Divers Alert Network. We're moving over now to equipment issues. Of course, your regulator is extremely important to you as a scuba diver, and your gas consumption can be affected if your regulator is hard to breathe from. Your secondary regulator has a slow leak. That could be a serious issue, and oftentimes less conscientious divers do not maintain control of their alternate air source as they should. They are usually, or not usually, but often dragging in the sand or banging around and not properly secured. Your regulator can start to free flow during freezing or debris, and as you might remember from your open water class, having a free-flowing regulator quickly depletes your air supply. Your mouthpiece can also come loose from your second stage, and your dive buddy can accidentally knock your regulator out of your mouth. So it's important that we pay close attention to our regulator.
Yeah, and I've got something just for the audience to think about tonight, going back to the return to diving information that we developed earlier this spring. And one of the modules in that program was, evaluating and assessing your equipment, checking it out to make sure it's good to go before you even get on that trip and get on that boat. Because, when you really think about it, when you store equipment, some people store it in the garage, in a hot attic, there could be cold in the garage, you could get O-ring cracking, all kinds of different things going on, and it's always wise to have that gear checked out before a professional or with a professional if that's been sitting around for, it could be a year, it could be a year or more with COVID and the travel restrictions we've had. So that's always a good idea before you even leave to have that evaluated.
It sure is. Most people feel like your gear should be serviced annually, and most people have had their gear put away for more than a year. So wise advice to go ahead and have your gear serviced before your next dive, unless that is not the situation. Your BCD is also a mission critical part of your dive. You can have inflator leaks or tears in your BCD. My BCD tipped out of a tank rack on a rough day off the coast of North Carolina. I thought everything was fine, put it back in, hopped in the water, and at depth, I noticed a distinctive hiss behind my head, and I noticed my air consumption seemed a little higher than normal. And sure enough, the first stage had punched a small hole in the top back of my BCD when it hit the deck, and I didn't notice it on the dive. So lesson there, be sure and check your gear extra carefully before you enter the water. Once again, don't just assume because it was left the dock, it was fine, it's fine now. Pressure gauges are an important part of our equipment. We've already talked about them several times. If your pressure gauge is integrated with your computer, a computer error may also affect the gauge. If your tank pressure does not decrease over time while you dive, you have a problem, and you should safely terminate the dive. Also, make sure your gauge is calibrated properly. Some gauges will not indicate 0 even when the tank is empty. To avoid this problem, make sure you return to the surface with the gauge indicating 500 psi or greater. It's not unusual for an analog gauge to be slightly out of calibration, and when turned off or not connected to anything, read a few hundred PSI. You should have that gear serviced if it's yours. If not, you should definitely make a mental note in the moment that you are essentially out of air at whatever that tank is reading at that point, 100 or 200 PSI. And finally, that brings us to our last but not least slide. And that is the very simple O-ring. O-rings should be replaced regularly. They're an incidental cost in scuba diving, and you should always carry your own with you. Even if you have a minor leak, replace the O-ring. It's very disconcerting to have an O-ring burst at depth. It quickly depletes your air supply and makes for an anxious dive. So go ahead and replace that O-ring whenever in doubt, and have a look at it and make sure it doesn't have any nicks or cuts in it. And don't open your regulator on your own. Regulators are simple but sophisticated piece of equipment, and only a trained professional should service a regulator. So let's go ahead and summarize some of the key points we talked about tonight. Maintain your equipment regularly. O-ring or whatever, inspect any rental equipment particularly carefully. It doesn't mean rental equipment should be any less dependable at a rental facility. It just means rental gear is used quite regularly and it has a higher rate of fatigue, so you should give it a close look anytime you begin to dive with it, just like I'm sure the dive operator does when it returns at the end of the day or at the end of the week if you kept the gear for your dive vacation. Once again, use a written pre-dive checklist and plan your maximum depth and duration of your dive so that you can safely achieve it with that available air supply. Open your tank valve all the way. Always conduct a pre-dive breath on your regulator and make sure your tank is full before the dive. Also, check that gas line and complete an in-water buddy check before descending. So as I close tonight, remember, safety starts with you. Out of air is an easily avoidable mistake that can carry very serious repercussions. The best strategy is to not run out of air. If you run out of your gas toward the end of a dive, remember your buddy is probably also low on gas, and there may not be a supply to accommodate the two stressed divers. Monitoring your gas supply is a simple step to prevent a serious emergency. Please dive safely, and thank you for tonight.
That was a great presentation, Greg, and I think one of the key takeaways for me just here listening tonight, it's a lot of simple things really that divers can do to make sure that they're safe, especially if they've been out of the water for a while and they're, even if they're experienced and they can't remember exactly because they're so excited to get back in there and take photographs or look at the creatures. But had some questions come in here, and if you're still with us tonight and have some questions, please post them in the chat there on the right on the YouTube page, and we'll get to those. But had a question here about water temperature and air consumption. We talked a little bit earlier about depth and physical activity, how strenuous it is, currents even. What effect does water temperature have? I mean, if it's really cold, are you kind of going to be using air more rapidly than if it was a warm water situation?
Absolutely. We've all been outside on a cold day and taken a chill, so to speak, to the point of actually shivering. And the same thing can happen to us as a scuba diver. So thermal protection is an important part of your dive plan. And if you do find yourself having miscalculated being cold on a dive, you should certainly factor that in and perhaps reduce your depth or your bottom time to account the fact that is a chill dive. And of course, if you find yourself too chilled, you should probably just end that dive, get proper attire, and then re-enter the water.
That's good advice. Good advice. Got another question here, and this is relating to servicing gear and gear sitting around for a prolonged period of time. Is there a general rule of thumb, like what could be serviced by the diver at home, or what type of repairs should be taken to a professional? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, in general, I think I would leave the regulators and first and second stages to a dive professional. They actually take classes on how to service gear, and they know what they're doing. On the other hand, a recreational diver, there are other issues that can come up that they're more than capable of addressing ahead of time. Fin straps, mask straps, things like that can have just as serious an impact on a dive if you find yourself finless or maskless. That's a whole nother scenario. But as far as regulator service, BCD service, I would leave that to the dive center.
The pros, absolutely.
Yep.
Right. Got a question that came in the chat here from Mitch, and he asks, is it dangerous to dive with an overpressurized regulator? I did a dive with a rental rig and it was slowly pumping out air. Any advice you could give to Mitch on an overpressurized regulator?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't know what the interstage pressure Mitch actually was experiencing there. It might have just been a poorly tuned second stage that was prone to free flow. I would hope that would be the case, but I hope Mitch acquired a different regulator for his next dive. Anytime that's the situation, I think it's better to move on to more properly functioned gear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got another question here before we wrap up. This one's from John, and John asks, does Dan have a sample checklist? And John, to answer your question at a high level, we have a wealth of information, safety tips, lots of years of research that we've put on the new dan.org website. What I'd advise you to do is go on to the dan.org site, check out the health resources. In there we have what we call smart guides. In that smart guide section, you can download a PDF of the items that we've talked about tonight. You can take that with you, print it out, take it with you on your trip if you need a refresher. There's also tons of other information on a host of topics, so make sure to explore the health resources on dan.org. And I'm looking here in the chat here. I don't see any other questions, Greg, so I think we can wrap this up for tonight. But before we conclude our presentation for this evening, just a quick reminder that next month we hope you'll join us Thursday, September 16th, same time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be presenting recompression chambers, and that will be hosted by Francois Berman and Dr. Matthias Neschetto. So thanks everyone again for watching, and a special thanks to all the Dan members out there. It's with your support and membership that we're able to continue producing educational content like this for the benefit of divers everywhere. So that's all for us tonight. Good evening and safe diving, everyone.